right, if you would, please take your Bibles and turn to the book of Genesis. And I hope you brought your Bibles today. Of course, the scriptures will be on the screen, but it's always important to familiarize yourself with your own Bible. I find many times that if I can't think of a verse exactly where it is, like book, chapter, verse, I can usually think where it is in my Bible, usually because I've highlighted or put a note there. So I hope you brought your Bibles today because we are going to be jumping around quite a bit. But again, for those of you who are here, you didn't bring your Bibles or you don't have one, of course, the scriptures will be on the screen for you. And we're in a series called Fields, and we're talking about the different valleys that we tend to go through in a given life. And this series, of course, will not be exhaustive. I'm not going to be able to talk about every type of valley. But in week 1, we did talk about the valley of depression, and we talked about my wife, of course, gave her testimony at the end there, and we looked at the life of Elijah, that if there's one person that probably you would think shouldn't be depressed, it should have been a prophet of God named Elijah. And but yet we find him depressed and calling out to God and running away and sleeping, and the Lord has to feed him. And we find a wonderful a story about a Christian man who just needed God to be there for him. And we learned in that first week that when you, as a Christian, will you be depressed? Yes, absolutely. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you're going to avoid being depressed. You may have bouts of depression that go on for weeks, months, and possibly even years. You may have seasonal depression. We're looking down the barrel of that right now as the days are getting shorter, which I absolutely hate. And but what do we do when we hit the valley of depression? And the answer from Elijah that we found is that when we commune with God, so in other words, when we go to our knees and we call out to God and we have prayer and we commune with God, but also when we fellowship with others, our depressed heart may not be cured, but it is soothed. Many people who struggle with depression will tell you it's not a curable disease, and it's true. There are many who carry depression throughout their entire life. So what do you do then? Is there no hope for the depressed person? No, of course there is. You have God, and you have your community here. If you are depressed today, you should be in church. You should be around other people who maybe are just as depressed as you are. You should be able to be a part of a service where we have music and a song like what Pat gave to soothe that depressed heart of yours. In the second week, we talked about the valley of deficiency. So the valley of depression, week 1, the valley of deficiency. What do we do when we're confronted with our own weaknesses? Not being a cynic and not being like self-hate, like woe is me, I'm dumb. But what do we do when we're presented with our own legitimate weaknesses, our deficiency? Well, Paul tells us that when you're weak, you can be strong. That just because, yes, you may have a weakness does not disqualify you from God's strength. In fact, for those of us who realize that we are weak, God's strength is freely offered to it. Our fragilities, our deficiencies in life, they are not curses, but gifts from God, which help us rely upon help us to rely upon God all the more. If you know that you're weak in an area, guess what you're going to do? You're going to find help. And God says you always need help. Some people just go through this life thinking that they're a pretty big deal, that you don't need help. But when the reality is God is offering his help to you, but there are too many people who are so prideful that they try to rely upon their own strength. Last week we talked about the valley of doubt, and we looked at it from a perspective of Moses, a gentleman who many wouldn't think of as a doubter, right? He is Charlton Heston. He is that super guy, that superhero of the Bible. But we looked at his starting point, and we realized that he was plagued with 5 of them, in fact. And he argued with God back and forth until God finally said, "Obey me, go." You see, As a Christian, are you going to struggle with doubt? Yes. Every Christian will struggle with their doubt. Does that disqualify you from being a Christian? No. Every Christian should question your faith. Why do we do this? Why do we have baptism? Why do we believe in Jesus Christ alone as the only way to heaven? Why? Churches and Sunday morning should be filled with a bunch of people saying, "Why, Pastor? Why are you telling me to do this?" You should come to the Scriptures with questions just as Moses did. And the more you question your faith, though, the more that you will come to realize that God is sufficient to answer every single one of your questions. Amen. He is sufficient for everything. Everything that Moses tried to lob at God, God showed him himself the more. Moses says, "I don't know who you are. I lack knowledge." And God says, "Well, here's my name." God says, "Don't you know who I am? I'm a murderer. I'm just a shepherd. I've been in the backwoods for 40 years. You want me to lead the people?" "Yes, Moses. In fact, you're not going to go under your own power. You're going to go under mine." "Well, the people aren't going to believe me. I live in a world." "God, have you seen the Israelites today? They are cynics, and they are frustrated. They're not going to believe me. Fine, I'll give you my power," God says. Every time Moses had an issue, God answered it with his own provision, what he would do for what he would do for Moses, And today, we're going to be talking about the valley of difficulty. The valley of difficulty. And we're going to be exploring the valley of difficulty through the life of a famous Bible character, a gentleman by the name of Joseph. And this story has actually been very close to my heart since I was a very young child because, as you know, I am the baby of the family. And many of you are like, "Yeah, you kind of give off that vibe." We can clearly see you're the baby of the family. And I was named Benjamin because I had an older brother named Joseph. And in the story of Joseph, he has a younger brother named Benjamin. So I grew up resonating with the story, and in many ways equating the Joseph I read in the Bible with the Joseph I live with under my roof. And a lot of times they didn't match up, right? Because the Joseph I live with would put me in a headlock, right? And give me, trouble and wedgies and such. So I didn't see Joseph in the Bible ever do that. And so I grew up with this story. And I know I'm looking around the room, and I know every single one of you. And I know all of you have read this story, okay? And so many of you may be prone to think, okay, we know kind of where this is going to go. So I want to challenge you like I challenged myself today. Try to look at the story like you've never read it before. When we come to stories like this, try to look at this story and try it. Remember, be questioning when you read. Why did these things happen? Who is this guy? How did that make them feel when it happened? And it'll bring this story alive to you. Because if there's one person in the Bible other than Jesus who had the most difficulty in life, it was Joseph. As we'll see, ironically, his own father's love was used against him. He doesn't complain, though. Nowhere in the story do we find Joseph complaining. He remains faithful. If the air in our church today is a little bit too cold, guess what I hear? "I'm cold." If it's during the hot, summer months and the air's on, but it's not bringing the temperature down, guess what I hear? "Pastor, I'm hot." Nowhere in this story do we find Joseph complaining. And his issues were far greater, and the things that he was grappling with were far more intense than anything we face. However, that's not to say that you do not face difficulty in your life. I make a joke about the air because we can all laugh about that. But again, I'm looking around the room, and I know your stories, and I know many of you have walked through very difficult times. Very difficult times, trying times. So what are you supposed to do when you find yourself in a valley of difficulty? You turn to the Scriptures and we read a story about someone who is going through a valley that may be as similar to yours today. So Genesis 37. Genesis 37, we're going to begin reading in verse 2. And again, like I said, we're going to be jumping around. In many ways, I'm going to be giving you the Reader's Digest version of Joseph's life, because I assume you know the story. But we begin here today, Genesis 37, verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Jacob had a son named, what's his name? And how old was he? How old was he? How old was he? Okay, great. I've said it now 3 times. You should probably remember that. Okay. Joseph was 17 years old, was pasturing his flocks with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Belial and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved, another name for Jacob is Israel. So Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age. Is it ever good for a parent to play favorites? No. This story is a lesson to us all to not ever play favorites, especially as a parent. It's not good, because guess what happens? When you start playing favorites, people get upset with you, but guess what they do to the person you're playing a favorite with? What do? They tease them. You put a target on their back. And that's exactly what Jacob did to Joseph. He not only did that, he didn't put a target on his back. Instead, he put a what? A robe of many colors. And he made him a robe of many colors, verse 4. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they what? Hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. We know how this story goes. What happens next, church? This will be my Sunday school hour as well as our main church hour. What happens next after this? Gets sold into slavery. But does anyone know? I know slavery is what happens to Joseph, but what was the first goal? Kill him. Yeah, the brothers, before selling him into slavery, they wanted to kill Joseph. Thankfully, another brother stepped in and said, instead of killing him, let's just sell him into slavery. What a good brother. And so they sold They sold Joseph into slavery. You see, I'm still last week. And then they lied to Jacob and said he was mauled by an animal. Gave him the coat of many colors, splashed with blood and tore up. And that breaks Jacob's heart. They sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. This is the brothers. And what happens? Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. Well, very considerate of Judah. And his brothers listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for how much? All right, top shelf slaves at this time went for 30. So they sold him mid-tier, right? He was a used car, right? And we'll get a deal here. We'll sweeten the pot. We won't sell him for the top deal. You know, he is 17 years old, so he's a kid. You can't sell him for 30, so we'll sell him for 20. And so the slavers took Joseph to Egypt. Now, you know the story of Joseph. Is this the end of his troubles or just the beginning? Just the beginning. He gets sold into slavery. Where does he get sold? Where does he go to live? Egypt, and with who? Potiphar. And God used Joseph, didn't he? And he gained favor, didn't he? And so Potiphar put Joseph at the head of his house. Joseph was so good at his job, Potiphar didn't even know everything that he had. He trusted Joseph that much. But what was the problem? The wife. We're not even told her name. Her name is Potiphar's wife. And so he's just doing his thing. Do you realize what Joseph is doing? He's trying to make the best out of a bad situation. And then he finds favor, and he thinks, think about him, right? He's 17, 18, 19 years old, somewhere around there. Okay, you know what? That was really awful what my brothers did. But hey, it's looking up. And then he looks around and he's like, why is my master's wife looking at me? So what happens? But one day, when Joseph, Genesis 39, I'm sorry, we're going to flip around here. So go 2 chapters later, fast forward in Joseph's life, Genesis 39. One day, when he, Joseph, went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she, Potiphar's wife, whatever her name is, caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. Now, was this the first time that Potiphar's wife came to Joseph? No. In fact, we actually don't know exactly how many times. We just know that the Bible tells us she came to him day after day. And Joseph says, no. But finally, she sees an opportunity. He's all alone. She says, grabs him by his garment. Have sex with me. And what does he do? But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. I always find this funny. Rather than be caught naked in the bed of his master's wife, he'd rather be caught naked running the streets. And as soon as she saw that Joseph had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard it, I lifted up my voice and cried out, and he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Do you realize how she was getting ahead of the narrative, wasn't she? Does anybody in that house believe her, what she's saying? No. But she's saying, here's the story. You all are just slaves. Here's the story, and you all better stick to it. Then she laid up his garment by her or herself until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. Oh, now the story has changed a little bit. Not only to lie, but to laugh, ridicule me, make fun of me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. Now, surely you would think that this man would know his wife, right? Apparently not. Apparently not, because this idiot believed her. And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into what? Prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now, Joseph gets sold into slavery. That's a bad day, can we say? Then he gets put into this house and he finds favor. And his master's wife is a little bit promiscuous, say a lot of bit promiscuous. And he says, no, 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 day after day, day after day, to finally he's put in a compromising situation, not of his own choosing. And now he's run out, and he's been an honest man. He's not touched his master's wife. And now he's put into prison for doing the right thing. How do you think Joseph felt? Now, we're reading this after the fact, but the Lord was with Joseph. That's a narrative ploy for you to understand. I know it looks bad here, but understand God is still with Joseph. Just hold your horses. Don't cast judgment until you hear the whole story. But does Joseph know this? No, we do because we read the story. And we know how it ends. But Joseph doesn't know that the Lord was with him while he was carted off to prison for not sleeping with his master's wife. How do you think that made him feel? Pretty bad. He might have said, Lord, why are you doing this to me? No good deed goes unpunished. Joseph was punished his entire life for doing good deeds. So what happens in prison, though? Who does he meet? The cupbearer and the baker. So he's in prison. Again, we don't know how long yet at this time. We get a marker here in a little bit. But let's say he's about 25, 26 or so. And he's now, just as he rose to the ranks in Potiphar's house, a prisoner rose to the ranks in a prison and was in charge of the prison. Does that make sense to anybody? Oh, hey, look, you were sent here for grand larceny. Can you look after this money? But that's exactly what happened. What kind of head prison, chief of the prison was just like, you can be in charge. Egypt had some weird laws, I guess. Anyways, he got favor. And so he's tending, he's serving, he's doing what he knows to do. He's making the best out of a really bad, and it keeps getting worse situation. Slavery, false accusation, now in prison. And finally, in walks into the prison these two people who are very green. They've never been to prison in their life. You got the cupbearer and the baker. They lived a good life. The cupbearer, given he could die of poisoning, but he got to drink quite a bit in the king's presence and be in the court and yada, yada, yada. The baker as well. I mean, I've never seen a baker not be, well, me, right? Plump. So they come into prison and they have these dreams. And the first one comes, a cupbearer, so the chief cupbearer comes and they're like, hey, we got these dreams. And Joseph, without hesitating, is like, well, who interprets dreams? Only God can. Let me help. Do you realize, even though he was in prison, he still kept his faith, still believed in God, and he still believed he could help people. Joseph is the eternal optimist. And here he was, saying, well, tell me your weird dream. And so they tell him. The chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, I got to get new glasses. As soon as it budded, whatever. You guys read the words better than I can. Its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was then in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head up, and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me. So he tells the cupbearer You're only going to be here for 72 hours. Let me make an impression on you. I've now told you your dream. Don't forget me. Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house, for I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. Now, does the cupbearer remember Joseph? No. And the other guy, the baker, does he get a good dream? No. He gets 3 days. Hey, in 3 days, the Pharaoh's going to call you in, and rather than raise you up and restore you, he's going to take your head. Sad, sorry state for the baker. But guess who forgot about him? The cupbearer. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer. So lifted up, in other words, honored him, and the head of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But what did he do? He hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but what? Forgot him. So Joseph, 17 years old, gets sold into slavery. Working in a house, falsely accused, gets sent to prison. In prison, he gets an opportunity to speak for himself. He helps someone who he doesn't have any obligation to help. And the only thing he asks is, hey, dude, when you're restored, remember me. And what's the one thing this dude does? He forgets him. And so Joseph is forgotten. Difficult. No good deed goes unpunished, right? He suffers. Joseph once again suffers for good. And he's forgotten. But guess who hasn't forgotten Joseph? God. God hasn't forgotten Joseph. Sadly, I have to breeze over the whole dream of Pharaoh. But the cupbearer remembers finally Joseph. And he tells this Pharaoh, he said, Pharaoh, you're having this weird dream with like stalks of wheat, and then there's a cow, right? And there's like 7 and 7, and they're all fat and plump, and then these like diseased, leprous cows, and crops start popping up. This is bizarre. 7 and 7, what does this mean? And everyone's like, we don't know. And then the cupbearer was like, hey, I forgot something. I met a dude once. I know he's in, now, Pharaoh, bear with me. He's in prison. Okay, so don't discount just yet. But he could interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh calls Joseph, and Joseph can interpret the dreams. That in the future, there's going to be 7 good years and 7 bad years of famine. So you need to prepare. And Pharaoh is like, well, who better can do it than the dude who can interpret dreams? And so Joseph goes from prison to second in the nation. What? And it's at this moment that Joseph realizes why God was doing what he was doing. 7 years go by, and there's good plenty. They farm, they collect so much that Joseph doesn't even know how much they have. That's how plentiful the 7 years were. But then the famine hits. Boom. 2 years into the famine, guess who walks through the door? His brothers. Well, look what the cat dragged in. And these brothers come walking through the door looking for food. How old did I tell you that we read, that God tells us, how old was Joseph when they sold him into slavery? Good. I'm glad you remembered that. Verse 46, Genesis 41:46. Joseph was what? 30. 30 years. I'm not good at the maths. Mr. John, what is 30 minus 17? 13 years, Mr. John? 13 years had passed. And Joseph wants to test them. Because guess what he learned in 13 years? Sometimes people make rash decisions, and those decisions are wrong. Like maybe selling your brother into slavery. And so he tests his brothers. And he uses his little brother, Benjamin, me, the favorite, as the test. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of the king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, went through all the land of Egypt, and during the 7 plentiful years of earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in land, and put the food in cities, and he put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. So then the brothers come. They get their grain. And finally, Joseph reveals himself. Like Joseph tells them, listen, I got to give me Benjamin. And finally, Reuben stands up and says, if we do that, it's going to kill my father. And he has this, the end of Genesis 44 is this impassioned speech of this brother saying, we can't give you the favorite. We know he's the favorite, but it'll kill our father if we do. And it wouldn't be right. Take me instead. And at this point we read in Genesis 45 verse 1, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he went aloud, and he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. So he got everyone out of the room, but they could still hear him crying. That's how loud Joseph was crying. 13 years. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Like he heard this speech from his brother in the previous chapter, and so he got to thinking, man, maybe they don't want to tell me because they don't know who I am, but maybe my father is already dead. I got to know. I'm Joseph. Hi. Is dad still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. Come closer. And they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Remember that? Remember that? You sold me into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For why? God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but who? God. 3 times he says this. God sent me. God sent me. You didn't send me. God sent me. And God has made me a father, or in other words, a father figure father to Pharaoh, and lord of all of his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. You've been great this morning, and I have one point for you. I imagine many of you got the handout today, and they're like, wow, this is going to be short today. Joke's on you. We just had a lot of reading to make one point. No difficulty is without some divine purpose. For those who follow God, no difficulty is without some divine purpose. Think about Joseph's life from his perspective. He had no idea why God allowed one misfortune after another to visit him. We know, don't we? We know why, but Joseph didn't. From his brothers selling him into slavery at 17, to being falsely accused of idolatry, thrown into prison, and finally being forgotten by a cupbearer who promised not to forget him. Joseph's setbacks were a complete mystery to him. He had no idea why this was happening to him until he was elevated to the second most powerful position in Egypt. And then he was like, oh, that's why. Hey, Christian, are you going to have difficulty in life? Yes. Does that mean that you have lost God's favor? Does that mean that God is not with you? No. I know your feelings are telling you, I've been abandoned. Imagine how Joseph felt in a pit being sold into slavery. Imagine how Joseph must have been felt when he was wrongfully accused of adultery. Imagine how Joseph must have felt while he was in prison. But through every difficulty, God was with Joseph. And if God was with Joseph, he will be with you too. I know life is hard. And I know many of you are facing into difficulties right now that I do not have the emotional currency to take on myself. But can I tell you, our God is bigger than your difficulties, and our God can carry you through those difficulties. And when you come out the other side, and you look back on your life and you say, oh, that's why God did that. Paul put it like this in Romans chapter 8. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them who are the called according to his purpose. I don't know what difficulty you're going through right now, but if you love God and you are abiding by his calling in your life, that difficulty will work out for God's good and your good too. I don't know what it is. We look at the difficulties of this life, and there's a loss of a job. Patrick talked about this week, or today, with the special song about the loss of a loved one. My grandfather, his brother. It doesn't make sense that the Christian can look at death and look at it like a good thing. How could you say that, Pastor Ben? I can say that because I love God, and I am called according to God's purpose. And even death itself, the difficulty of death itself, does not discourage me. Or if it does, it doesn't discourage me for long. Maybe you're sick. Our church has been ravaged by sickness these past few weeks. Lord, why are you doing this? Why are you allowing this to happen to me? I don't know. I don't know. But if you love God, and if you are like Joseph, and you went from one difficulty to the next difficulty to the next difficulty and saying, God, I'm just going to be faithful to you. I'm not going to lose my faith, even if I'm in prison. Even if I'm in prison, I'm not going to lose my faith. But you trust God through every difficulty. Eventually, you're going to come out the other side and be like, wow, that's what you were doing. The only way for all things to work together for good in your life is if you are working towards God's goals. Hear me this morning and I'm done. God wastes no experience in the Christian life. God wastes no experience in the Christian life, be it a good experience, be it a bad experience, be it a middling experience. God wastes no experience in the Christian life. He utilizes them all to accomplish his work. So what do you do when you're walking through the valley of difficulty? You carry on. You say, Lord, I don't know why you're allowing this to happen to me, but I trust you. I love you, and I'm called according to your purpose. I'm going to the next thing. God, why am I in a slaver's pit? God doesn't give you an answer. Fine. I'll go to the next thing. God, now why am I in prison? God doesn't give you an answer. All right, I'll go to the next thing. Be like Joseph. Be like Joseph in the valley of difficulties, who just kept going until it made sense. Someday we're going to look back on life in that great beyond, and we're going to look at our life and we're going to think, that's what God was doing. That's why God allowed this to happen and that to happen. Our gracious Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us, Father, as we go from here. That, Lord, many of us, maybe even this morning, are entering valleys of difficulty. That we don't know why you've allowed certain trouble to come into our life, but Lord, here's the promise. Lord, for those of us who love you and for those of us who are called and obedient to your call, Lord, you promised that you would work out all things for good. For your good, for my good. And so, Lord, I pray that as we go from here today, that we would have the spirit of Joseph to just go to the next thing. And Lord, if you are so gracious to us to allow us to see in this life the reasoning behind the things that you do, why you allow difficulty in life, Lord, that'd be great. But I pray that you would help us when we don't know the why, to trust in you regardless, to have that faith, to know that you're walking with us through our valley of difficulty. I love you, Jesus, and all God's people said, amen and amen. Thank you for your attentiveness this morning. I love you, church. I'm going to be over here. If you want to talk with me, I want to talk with you. Please do not forget tonight, communion, 6 p.m., and then budget meeting to follow. If you, my members, did not get a budget sheet, find Pastor Bob. He'll give you one. Review it. If you have any questions, bring them tonight. God bless you. You are dismissed.